And I think we're live. Let's see. Waiting for everything to process through. Okay, we're live on Instagram. And it looks like we're live on YouTube, and we should be live on Facebook. Okay, so welcome back. It is November 6th. It is 72 degrees. Let me say that again. It's November 6th, and it's 72 degrees at 8 p.m. I want my fall back. Okay, I want 50s and 40s and 30s. This is no good. This is no good at all. Tonight, we're going to talk about some of the factors of where we're going with this fall. I knew this fall was going to be warm. I just didn't expect 72 degrees on November 6th at 8 p.m. We also have a hurricane that we're going to talk about and the pattern over the next 15 days. Of course, I'm still battling my dry cough, so I got Hall's lozenges, I got tea, I got water. I got everything I could possibly do, but there's a chance I could be coughing later on or during this chat, so I do apologize. So we'll go over everything. And again, just want to say hello. I hope everyone had a wonderful Halloween. And now we're going to be getting ready for Thanksgiving. We'll keep an eye on the weather pattern for that. I just can't get over the fact, I'm just thinking to myself, I'm getting ready to go online. And now it dropped. We're down to 71.8 in Freehold at 8 p.m. on November 6th. And technically, if we had the clocks forward, it'd be 9 p.m. So, yeah, I'm not happy about that. But let's talk about what is actually going on. And we'll talk about why we are having this warm pattern. So, we have a hurricane, Hurricane Rafael. It was a Category 3 hurricane that slammed into the western coast of Cuba. It was briefly a Category 3 hurricane while it was on this side of the waters in the northern Caribbean. It moved through and now is expected to continue to slowly and steadily weaken. It's moving to the northwest at 13 miles per hour, has winds of 105 miles per hour. It's still a potential threat for portions of Texas and maybe Louisiana. No threat for us, although we could certainly use the rainfall. It is so dry out there. Some locations haven't seen rainfall in over 2 months. That's very dry. Now, the one thing I will say about this pattern is that Mother Nature has a way of balancing things out. So I do expect in the future, possibly the near future, sometime maybe in 2025, we'll get to the point where we'll say no more rain. But we are certainly not at that point right now in this weather pattern. So why is Rafael expected to weaken? Well, let's take a look at some of the factors here. First of all, of course, it moved over western Cuba, so it's dealing with some landmass interaction. Certainly plenty of convection over the low-level center. It has very nice outflow. It was developing very impressively earlier on this afternoon before making the landfall into Cuba, with a great outflow, very strong central dense overcast, a well-established eye wall. Now it's starting to get a little bit ragged. Why is it expected to weaken? Well, let's take a look at the upper level winds. This is the upper level winds at 850 millibars, right? And as you can see, we have a nice ridge here, and it extends into the Gulf of Mexico. So the steering currents are going to take this storm to the west and heading towards the central Gulf of Mexico. But when we take a look at 250 millibar winds, well, look, those winds are from the southwest. So again, let's back up. These winds are coming from east to west. These winds, southwest to northeast. You can't get more of a textbook example of strong vertical wind shear, then literally winds moving in the complete opposite direction of each other from 850 millibars to 250 millibars. So this essentially rips the storm apart in the vertical. So the low level circulation gets displaced from the mid and upper level circulation. And so what happens is that the warm core structure and the exhaust capability falls apart. And what you'll see over the next couple of days is a lot of the thunderstorms and convection get ripped away to the east of the low level circulation. And so that's why we're expecting a steady weakening process. Excuse me. The other factor is there is a ton of dry air in the Gulf of Mexico. So you have two very, very poor environments here. You have vertical wind shear and you have plenty of dry air. This is certainly great news for the Gulf Coast in terms of any type of potential direct impact. Whatever does reach the central Gulf of Mexico is going to be a much weaker, much more disorganized storm. So that's certainly some great news in that respect. Excuse me. Also the factor that just the Gulf of Mexico, climatologically speaking, is starting to cool down. So your sea surface temperatures are not as supportive as they were a month ago or 2 months ago, certainly. As far as the track, the ensemble guidance here is focusing more to the west and maybe the southwest. And this is the European ensemble guidance. GFS is a little bit further north. Why is that the case? Well, here in the GFS, you have your ridge right here. It expands and basically forces the storm to the south with less influence of this upper level low. So you still have the vertical wind shear, but at the mid levels, well, you have more of a forcing mechanism towards Mexico, which could allow for a little bit further intensification if it got into, let's say, the Bay, Campeche, and areas like that. But the point is that it would be no threat to the United States. The GFS, though, it doesn't have the ridge as strong, and you get more influence from the upper level low in this trough. So as a result, yeah, the storm's able to move a little bit further north, but at the same time, it gets completely ripped apart. So all you really have to deal with is just rainfall along the western and central Gulf Coast. In any scenario, there is no support for any type of strong, not even a strong tropical storm at this point, impacting the United States. So that's some great news. I want to make sure that's very clear. In this environment, simply put, this is a situation where this storm is going to be steadily weakening, and the only question is whether it makes landfall in Mexico or in Texas. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. My guess is that probably around southern Texas as a weak tropical storm or even a tropical depression by the time it gets drifted towards around Brownsville or maybe portions of northern Mexico. The rest of the tropics are quiet. The MJO is moving out of the favorable phase. We'll start to see that the season becomes more and more quiet as we head towards the end of the month, with, of course, the Atlantic hurricane season ending on November 30th. So we are definitely moving towards the end. And basically right now, we're 2 storms away from my forecast. I was expecting 20, we're at 18. So ends up that the forecast did better than I thought. And I was far more conservative. A lot of people were going like 29, 30 storms. I thought that was a bit too aggressive. So I might be about 2 storms off from the forecast. Once we get towards the end of the season, I will post a review of the seasonal forecast for the hurricane season in the premium section for everyone to check out who's a premium member. Now, what about our weather pattern overall? Well, our La Nina still hasn't established itself, and it's November. If it locks in, yeah, if it locks in, it's going to be a very weak La Nina and more east based than anything else. Your coldest anomalies are being focused in Nino 3 and Nino 1 plus 2. Had a little bit of expansion, a little bit of uptick in Nino 3.4. But the overall average is basically around Nino 3, which is about here. Why is this important? Well, out here's the date line. And if you don't have a lot of cold water out here, well, you're going to have the potential for convection. And when the MJO moves into phase 8 and 1, there's a better potential for that MJO to enhance the subtropical jet stream this winter and enhance the potential for storm outbreaks. Yes, there is still potential here for winter storms. Not anytime soon, not when it's 71 degrees out right now, obviously. But I wouldn't lose hope in the winter completely. I'm not expecting any blockbuster snow seasons this year, unless you're up in New England. I think that's a good shot, or certainly at Great Lakes. But for our neck of the woods, I could see a few storms popping off out of this because it's a weak La Nina. It's a weak east-based La Nina. So at the very least, you have the potential for some high latitude blocking being on the table here. Not all season, but periods. So we could pop off one or two major winter storms this year out of this pattern. We have our negative PDO set up here, very much robust, no changes in that. The Atlantic is starting to cool down as you would expect. Some cooler waters out here towards the Western Atlantic, towards the United States, but very warm water here. This signal would support more of a storm development out here, so you could get a couple of upper level lows around, let's say, Newfoundland this winter to definitely keep an eye on. But as you can see with the SOI, not really all that impressive. Look, as I said last year, year before that, if you want to have an understanding of the impacts of a La Nina or El Nino, you really want to keep an eye on the SOI. And this is marginal. 2.72 for monthly, 3.67 for seasonal. In November for a La Nina, it barely ranks. Okay, there's some talk about this being a moderate La Nina if you make some adjustments to statistics for climate change. That's cute for sea surface temperatures, and you could do that, absolutely. But it doesn't change the forcing parameters. And the forcing parameters right here tell me we got a very weak signal. So when I see this, I really, really want to keep an eye on the MJO state, which if I start to see right now with the forcing heading from, let's say, 8-1, as we move through and head towards 1, 2, and 3, and 4 for November, in terms of getting a sustained trough in the east, not the best. But if you start getting that forcing focus more towards 7, 8, and 1, as you move into December and November, that is where things get interesting. And the thing with an east-based La Nina is that you start getting all your forcing out here, again under a sinking air substance under Nino 3, as you can see where this is setting up, then at least you open up the door and the potential. So I'm not trying to give you any type of false hope of like, oh, look, we're going to have major winter storms all over the place. But I am saying that there's a potential here that we could get a few periods in this setup in the tropical forcing where we have some storm potentials, maybe in January. I'm not really all that enthusiastic about December. I think we cool down more towards normal, but there's a factor here that we cannot ignore. And that's what's going on with the polar vortex. Excuse me. Now, the QBO has my attention. For those of you who don't know what the QBO is exactly, let me walk you through this. The QBO right now is in the westerly phase. These are winds at 30 and 50 millibars. So when they're in the westerly phase, they're moving along with the Earth's circulation. So they enhance the development of the polar vortex and tends to make it stronger because everything's moving in the same direction, right? So all the forcing is moving in the same direction, so you can move the car faster, right? When the QBO goes into easterly phase, there's some push against the polar vortex, which leads to the potential for weakening. Now, one thing I was not expecting to see, especially in November, maybe in February, maybe in late January, but certainly not in November, was the QBO starting to show an east descending phase so quickly. Why is this important? If we're moving towards an east phase, there's going to start to be more fight against the polar vortex as we move through the winter season. And we're going to go into a period of neutrality where basically you end up with a wild card here, rather than an indication of a strong support for a strong polar vortex. You get the potential here for the QBO to weaken between 0 and plus 10. Why is this important? Well, when you're in 0 to plus 10 in the QBO, it opens up the potential for more high latitude blocking. So again, this leads to the fact that, hey, I wouldn't put away your shovel and ignore the rest of the winter. I'm not saying it's going to be cold all winter, but this is a sign of a wild card that we really need to watch. Because if this starts to evolve here, then this strong polar vortex signal may start to feature more stretching. Now, as I said in the winter forecast, and I said a couple of weeks ago, there's clearly a difference between the evolution of the polar vortex at 10 millibars, which we're looking at here, which is very strong, very robust. If we just use this side here, this basically means, excuse me, this basically means all your polar and Arctic air is locked up in Siberia. Done. Okay? It's not getting towards the mid-latitudes. Very mild weather pattern for really much of the United States. This would clearly signal more of a support for Pacific dominant air masses. But we don't just look at 10 millibars. We should look at 50 millibars or 100 millibars to see how that's setting up as we descend. And while we're clearly seeing a stronger polar vortex setting up in Siberia, which clearly supports our continuation of a mild weather pattern through November, there's no doubt about that. That's not changing. We are seeing more stretching occurring already at this level. And in this setup, it just sets up transient polar air masses. So you can get one or two strong cold fronts. And we actually have that in the forecast being a signal that could drop temperatures for a day or two towards near or even below normal. But it won't last. What you need to see change, if you're looking for, like, Stephen, what can we do to change this weather pattern? This needs to be here. It doesn't have to be split or even weakening. You just got to get the polar vortex on the other side of the Earth. You have it, which sounds hard, more difficult than what it really is. It's sitting over Siberia. We need it to sit over around the Hudson Bay. So that's what we have to look for as we move towards December and, of course, into January. I don't see any indication of any type of support for a split in the polar vortex this winter, but a lot of stretching, absolutely. And if that stretching sets up just right, things could get interesting around here. So the pattern overall is such that you don't have any sustained polar or Arctic air masses in place over the next 15 days. You get more of a Pacific influence. There is that signal that's showing up towards the end of the 10-day period by the middle of this month, let's say around the 14th to the 16th, depending on the timing of the cold fronts, for a brief polar air mass. But look at the overall theme here. This is maybe a 2-day, maybe less, maybe 36-hour impact on the northern mid-Atlantic in the middle of the month of a cool pattern. And this might actually bring us the potential for some heavier rainfall for a day. Not enough to break the drought or anything, but at least it's something. And then when I see this signal here, again, this supports most likely through Thanksgiving of above normal temperatures and dry weather conditions. I don't see any major storms in the horizon in this setup. What's that?
Drink something.
Oh.
Here.
I'll drink some water. Okay, so this leads us to right now, where a couple of days ago in the model guidance, there was a lot of support for scattered showers. We barely have an isolated shower. With a cold front that is weakening into a trough, you can see the cold front passage back here, more of a northwesterly winds. Let me refresh this weather tap real fast. But again, I'm not really seeing much in the way of rainfall here. Like, wow, there's a few lone showers here in northern New Jersey. That's barely reaching the ground. So, unfortunately, the potential for rainfall is nil for most locations. And the reason why is because in the atmosphere, you have a lot of low-level dry air that is just limiting the potential for rainfall over the region. On the water vapor satellite picture, the lifting is disorganized. So even if you had mid-level moisture to support some rainfall, the disorganization of the lifting in the mid-levels with the frontogenesis just inhibits any type of shower development. And you can see as a result in the infrared satellite picture, not much in the way of cold cloud tops at all around the region. Over the next 10 days, again, we'll watch this ridge to see how it plays out with Rafael. But for us, not much in the way of any major storms. If you have plans for this weekend, it's going to be absolutely beautiful. Perfect weather conditions for any type of outdoor activities. It actually will be a little bit cooler too. We're talking about temperatures in the 50s and 60s. But again, here's that trough. This is probably a bit overdone. Maybe you get like a little wave of low pressure trying to show up here. I'm a little skeptical of this idea. I like this idea of this stretch because it matches up with the polar vortex stretch. But notice to the pattern to the west here, just more Pacific air streaming in through the Rockies into the plains, driving out anything that tries to take hold here. Over the next 90 hours, not much way of lifting. Your threat of a shower is basically tonight to early tomorrow morning. Other than that, quiet all the way on through the weekend. Plenty of dry air this weekend. Look at 700 millibars. 700 millibar relative humidity on Saturday morning is going to be below 10%. You can't get drier than that. Heck, some of the model guides is as low as almost 1 or 2%. I don't buy 0%, but that's pretty low. And as far as the intrusion of polar and Arctic air, again, we get that brief shot this weekend, getting us back towards near normal. Doesn't last long. Keyword here, transient with these polar air masses. The dominant air masses from the Pacific. Here's our next shot for next week. This is probably a bit overdone, a little bit too strong, but I do like maybe -2 to 0 degrees Celsius, 850 millibars. So maybe 40s and 50s for a day or two. And then you can see the moderating influence already just kind of crushing and sending this out as quickly as it comes in. So yeah, maybe a support for some heavier rainfall on Friday, next Friday. But I wouldn't be making any plans or celebrations of that. I wouldn't lock that in or bet on it. I tell you that much. So that is pretty much what we have set up for this week. Let's go and take some of your questions. Of course, we'll start off first with the premium chat, and then we'll check out social media to see what you guys got. Any interesting questions, and then we'll go from there. Let's see here. As always, good evening, everyone. Card, how you doing? Saw the 18Z GFS has the hurricane going into the Gulf and doing clockwise circle while dissipating, and then saw the forecast come from the NHC, and well, it is not out of the realm of possibility for once. Yeah, the 18Z GFS, I wouldn't say it's in the realm of possibility. I wouldn't be surprised if it just moves straight into the central Gulf of Mexico and just collapses as it heads towards Texas and Mexico. Was able to wear a t-shirt when I went out to vote last night. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Noticed a couple of things on Earth News School. One, there seems to be a pretty healthy feed from tropical regions to the poles at 10 millibars, even with westerly QBO. Yeah, I've been noticing that, and I'm very curious to see how long that lasts. I think that's part of the disruption that we're seeing at 50 millibars, 70 millibars, and 100 millibars. To the 250 millibar jet streak in Asia and the Pacific, even when they got going, aren't quite as long or as lasting as they have been in previous years. Yes, I've noticed that too, which is why, while I do expect periods of mild conditions this winter, I also expect that we're going to have the potential for a couple of periods of stormy, cold weather. I'm just not confident in buying into the high latitude blocking yet, but the easterly QBO signal certainly has my attention. Also notice that while we are still getting stretches with a lot of sunspots, the length of the stretches seems to be decreasing. Yeah, you'll see that as we head towards the solar minimum over the next 5 years. We'll probably reach a solar minimum by, I say, 2030. And then the influences of a solar minimum in 2031 and 32. I would not be surprised. Just kind of, I guess, guessing here. But I wouldn't be surprised if we have a couple of blockbuster winters in the early 2030s. I'm just going to put that out there. We'll see if I'm right. But I have a theory in the interaction of solar activity and 500 millibar patterns. And I would say the early 2030s could be rather interesting around here. I noticed you touched on it in your winter forecast, but if La Nina ends up La Nada and is cold neutral rather than La Nina, yeah, if that happens, that doesn't get rid of the ridge around the Bahamas because you have that influence from the MJO, but it certainly makes the subtropical jet stream stronger, and it increases the potential for the polar jet stream to dip a little bit further south. Not excessively south, like in an El Nino scenario, but enough to create more interaction, let's say, from the Tennessee River Valley to the Mid-Atlantic coast. So certainly it would increase the potential for some interesting weather. Aaron here. Steve, the National Weather Service is forecasting a nice light rainfall event for Sunday, Monday. You seem less bullish on it. Could you explain? Yeah, well, let me see here. Let me pull up the data here, and then I'll flip it over. Okay, so let me turn this over. Okay, so here we are Sunday into Monday. First of all, precipitate water values get pushed out here very quickly. And when we take a look at 700 millibar relative humidity, it doesn't remain anywhere near 80% for very long. And when we take a look at 500 millibars, you can see that there isn't a lot of strong lifting, and you have this ridge axis here. All this tells me, especially considering the dry conditions in place, variable cloud cover, a few isolated widely scattered showers, and I'm kind of pushing with the widely scattered showers. Look, consider this. The rainfall, which is basically 1 or 2 showers, for tonight, 3-4 days ago, was featured as scattered showers. Now we have a shower. Beforehand, even 2 days ago, QPF for today was maybe 1/10 of an inch. We might struggle to get 1/100th of an inch now. So when I look at this doesn't tell me any type of overrunning scenario or any isotropic lifting. And it sure as heck doesn't have any organized lifting. And the moisture involved gets kicked out very quickly. And that's at the mid-levels. Let's not even go over the lower levels from 9 to 25 millibars to the surface. That is as dry as can be. What you want in this scenario is really a nice cyclogenesis off of, let's say, Virginia or the Delmarva Peninsula that just drives Atlantic moisture into the region and sets up a nice light to moderate rainfall with a focus of PVA right over the region. This scenario cutting up towards the St. Lawrence River Valley is not going to cut it for us. Okay? You have too much low-level dry air, and the strongest lifting keeps on getting focused towards central New York and the eastern Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River Valley in Canada. Not what we need. We need a strong moisture transport, sustained moisture transport from 850 millibars down to the surface to overcome the dry environment that we have in place. So you get that Atlantic moisture coming in, moistens everything up, you get some drizzle, some light rain, you get a little bit more focused lifting, and you get a light to moderate rainfall setup. That's not this. Let's see. Given the lengthy stretch of dry weather, perhaps the Lawrence of Arabia should play in the background. Well, possibly. Does the dry air in the atmosphere combined with the really dry soil conditions create somewhat of a feedback loop? Great question. Yes. Especially when you're dealing with cold front passages coming in from the west. The cold front passages coming in from the west are dependent on moisture transport out ahead of the cold front, southwesterly winds, frontogenesis, and convective development. Even if it's minor convective development that just produces showers. That convective process requires low-level moisture. With the dry air in place, well, let's go back to the SKU-T here. And we'll zoom in. Okay, so here's our mid-level moisture, which on the model guidance looks like, hey, 90%, right? There's your mid-level moisture. There's your low-level moisture situation. So yeah, you could see a few showers up here. By the time the rainfall gets down here, the only thing you get is that temperatures fall off to 69 or 68. It doesn't precipitate because you have too much dry air to overcome. So it feeds back on itself, which means that you extend the dry period, which enhances the low-level dry air, which means it's even more difficult to get rainfall. So now you won't get it done with a simple cold front passage. At this point now, what we need is some real cyclogenesis and a slowing of a trough off the Delmarva Peninsula. That's what we need. Because then what you would get is a nice easterly wind that would basically erode this dry layer. Excellent question, Bill. Let's check out social media. Let's see, we'll start with YouTube. Let's see. Whoa. I'm trying to pick the best one. Any implications on early winter for New Jersey? Nothing yet. I don't want to jump on anything different from what my winter forecast was. Nothing really has changed thus far. Well, we already touched on Clippers with the winter forecast. I'll leave that alone. Let's see. Especially with La Nina, the Southeast Ridge is going to be a constant theme throughout this winter. Yes, the drought is feeding itself. Yes, it's creating a feedback loop. So unfortunately, we need a real pattern change. And I mean like a real blockbuster pattern change where what I would look for is a ridge popping in Alaska. I can't envision the Southeast Ridge collapsing because that's typical of even a weak La Nina. Displaced towards Bahamas, sure. But if you really want to see a pattern change, what you want to see is a ridge developing in the Gulf of Alaska, which forces a broad trough over the eastern two-thirds of the United States, which then could at least set up a storm track more towards the coastal waters of the United States, towards, let's say, the Delmarva Peninsula, the coastal waters of Delaware and New Jersey, that could at least set up the potential for rainfall. What we have right now isn't going to cut it. Any questions on X or Facebook or anything? Any questions on X or?
Yes.
All right.
Or snow on X.
Let's see what we got here.
That's it.
Will it ever snow? Yeah. You know, here's the thing. Here's a lot of people forget, maybe because they weren't even born, it's a possibility,
Possible, yes.
about the 1980s. We thought it was a big deal if we had like 2 inches of snow, right? God, I remember that. And then even the early 90s, it was like, oh, snow, but it kept on changing over to rain. Then 95, 96 hit, and we had more snow than what we've seen in 2 decades. So my point is that weather patterns go in cycles. We're in a really rough one now, especially if you're a snow removal or anything of that nature. But these patterns will shift.
Facebook.
The PDO is at record levels. Check out the past winters when it's been like that. Oh, I know. The potential's there. The signals are there for there to be some interesting weather if things line up right. Especially with a weak east-based La Nina. So, yeah, I just don't want to provide any false hope here, okay? Or to post long-range CFS guidance that could show a winter storm. Some people do that. There are signals that say, hey, things could change very nicely in mid-December. But we need time to really flesh out what those signals look like and what the details are. Let's see. Back to the computer chat. What does the Western Pacific look like tropical-wise? Any strong typhoons? So far, no strong typhoons that impact the 500 millibar pattern. But we'll be keeping an eye on it. But nothing. We had a couple of strong typhoons out there, but nothing that directly would change the 500 millibar pattern. That would concern us. So unfortunately, nothing of that nature. Okay. And I think we answered all the questions here. Do we have any?
Nothing else, no.
All right. So we answered all those questions. Before we do that, let me go check on our hurricane, see if anything's changed. We'll refresh the satellite picture. And interesting. Let's check this out real fast, and we'll probably end it here. But okay. So what am I noticing here? The shear is already starting to impact the outer portion of the outflow here. Convection still pretty strong around the low level center, but the storm, which is already small, is starting to feel those impacts. Now, why is it important that I mention that the storm is small? Small storms can intensify rapidly. They can go from a tropical storm to a Category 4 hurricane in less than a day. We've seen that, right? But at the same time, these little storms can also fall apart just as quickly. So, I think we've seen the strongest of Rafael. And I think from this point on, what you're going to see is this low-level center start to have a lot of the convection that's around the center right now start to get displaced more in this location here. And notice a lot of your convection is focused out here and not so much out here. And you're going to see that trend continuing to the point where the storm starts to really start to weaken once it gets out here. Don't be surprised by tomorrow at this time, we're talking about a tropical storm rather than a hurricane. I would not be surprised by that. Because when you have this type of structure in the storm where it's very, very small and tight, something where it's ripping it apart vertically at 250 millibars and 850 millibars, you're basically doing this. When that happens, these type of storms just collapse on themselves. So I would not be surprised. I think we're starting to see that process now. I would not be surprised if we see that enhanced by tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow evening, where we get a rapid fall off in intensity. And with that, with no more questions out there, I think we'll call it a night before I choke myself with all this coughing. I do want to apologize for the coughing, but also I want to thank you for your patience, as it can be a bit annoying, I know, but we'll get through it, right? In the meantime, as always, stay safe out there, and I'll see you next week. Or maybe we'll actually have a chance to talk about some real rainfall impacting the region, because God knows we know it and we need it. In the meantime, have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow morning.